Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be exploring the world of satire,
Okay.
specifically through an audio clip from Alex Jones's Infowars show.
Hmm.
Now, I know this is a bit of a departure
Yeah.
from our usual deep dives, but stick with us because this is going to be interesting.
Okay.
So even though this audio clip is presented as a joke,
Right.
it actually weaves in real-world news and events.
Okay.
So we're not here to endorse or debunk any political stances,
Gotcha.
but rather to examine how satire can use real-world events to create humor and commentary.
So we're looking at kind of a fascinating blend of fact and fiction here.
Exactly.
And it raises some pretty interesting questions about how satire operates,
Right.
especially in the context of something like Infowars, which has a history of blurring those lines.
Exactly. So the segment we're about to hear is framed as a joke by Alex Jones himself,
Okay.
and it involves this fake phone call from a Russian agent
Uh-huh.
who's giving him instructions. And of course, this plays into the very real concerns about Russian interference in U.S. elections,
Right.
particularly around the 2016 election.
Yeah.
But the way Jones uses these real-world anxieties
Yeah.
as comedic fodder is what I find so intriguing.
Right. And by tapping into those anxieties,
Yeah.
he's not just making a joke. He's engaging with a pre-existing narrative
Okay.
that was already circulating in certain circles.
Yeah.
So this is where the satire becomes multi-layered.
Oh,
It's not just about making people laugh.
Uh-huh.
It's about playing with their perceptions of reality.
Do you think that makes it more effective as satire?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And I think it depends on the listener.
Okay.
For some, the humor might act as a distancing mechanism,
Right.
allowing them to engage with these sensitive topics
Okay.
without feeling directly threatened.
Gotcha.
But for others, it might reinforce their existing beliefs,
Right.
making them more susceptible to misinformation.
So before we dive into the clip itself, can you talk a bit about the techniques that Alex Jones uses to create this satirical effect?
Sure, one of the most obvious techniques is exaggeration.
Okay.
He takes these real-world concerns about Russian interference
Yeah.
and blows them up to an absurd degree,
Right.
creating this over-the-top scenario that's both humorous and unsettling.
Right. Like when he plays the role of a Russian agent receiving instructions.
Right.
I'm curious to hear how that plays out.
Yeah,
Shall we give it a listen?
absolutely. Let's see how he sets up the joke.
Okay, so he's laying it on thick with the Russian accent.
Yeah.
And the whole secret agent persona, it's almost cartoonish, but I can see how some people might find it funny.
It's definitely playing with stereotypes,
Right.
which is a common tactic in satire.
Okay.
By using those exaggerated accents and mannerisms,
Yeah.
he's creating a caricature of the Russian threat,
Right.
almost mocking the very idea.
But is there a risk that by doing so,
Yeah.
he's actually reinforcing those stereotypes?
Sure.
For some listeners, I mean, not everyone is going to pick up on the satirical intent.
That's the tightrope walk that satirists always face.
Yeah.
They have to strike a balance between humor and commentary.
Okay.
And there's always the risk that some people will misinterpret the message.
Now let's see how the satire unfolds further as we listen to Daria, the Russian handler.
Right.
Wow, they really went all out with the Russian handler bit. The thick accent, the obsession with Hillary Clinton. It's like a caricature of Cold War espionage films.
And that's precisely what makes it work as satire.
Right.
It's playing with familiar tropes and stereotypes in a way that exposes their absurdity.
Yeah.
It's almost like he's saying, look how ridiculous this whole narrative is.
I noticed he was also given some very specific missions,
Yeah.
like building a wall and bringing back jobs. Those sound awfully familiar, don't they?
Yes, they do.
Yeah.
They directly mirror Trump's campaign promises.
Right?
And that's where the satire gets really interesting.
Okay.
By appropriating Trump's rhetoric,
Oh.
it makes you question whether Jones is genuinely endorsing those policies or subtly critiquing them.
So is he with Trump or is he making fun of Trump?
Exactly.
It's almost impossible to tell.
And that ambiguity is part of what makes this type of satire so potent.
Right.
It leaves the interpretation up to the listener,
Yeah.
allowing them to project their own beliefs onto it.
And then there are the more outlandish claims like lowering IQs with vaccines and containing the collapse of the United States. These are clearly exaggerated for comedic effect.
Of course.
Yeah.
But even within those exaggerations,
Right.
we can see a reflection of real anxieties and conspiracy theories that were circulating at the time.
It's fascinating how he manages to weave together these real-world fears with this over-the-top comedic persona.
Yeah,
It's almost like a dark comedy routine masking some pretty serious issues.
right.
But before we dive into those deeper issues, I think it's time to address the elephant in the room. The sudden shift from satirical Russian agent to genuine Infowars product advertisement.
Yeah.
That transition was incredibly jarring, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It highlights the dual nature of Infowars as both entertainment and a platform for promoting products and ideologies,
Right.
but also raises some ethical questions about using humor to potentially manipulate an audience.
It's like he's using humor to lower the audience's guard before hitting them with a sales pitch.
Yeah, it's definitely a clever marketing tactic,
Yeah.
but it also raises questions about the boundaries between satire and manipulation.
Mm.
I mean, is he genuinely trying to inform his audience, or is he simply using humor to sell products?
That's a question that has been debated for years,
Right. Yeah.
especially when it comes to figures like Alex Jones.
Right.
Some argue that his over-the-top persona is all an act,
Yeah.
a way to entertain and provoke while simultaneously building a brand.
Right.
Others believe that he genuinely subscribes to the conspiracy theories he espouses.
It can be tough to tell where the performance ends and the real beliefs begin.
It is hard to tell, and I think that ambiguity is part of what makes him so fascinating and perhaps so dangerous.
Exactly, because when you blur those lines between fact and fiction,
Yeah.
it becomes difficult for the audience to discern what's real and what's not.
Right.
And that's especially concerning when you're dealing with topics that have real-world consequences, like politics or public health.
Speaking of public health, I was struck by how he casually threw in that line about lowering IQs with vaccines.
Right.
That's a very real and dangerous conspiracy theory that has been debunked countless times.
And yet it persists, and by including it in his satirical bit, Jones is giving it a platform, even if it's under the guise of humor.
So even though he's framing it as a joke, he's still potentially contributing to the spread of misinformation. It's like a wolf in sheep's clothing.
Precisely,
Mhm.
and that's the danger of satire, especially when it's used in a context like this. It can be incredibly effective at disseminating information, but it can also be easily misused.
It's a reminder that we can't just passively consume information, even if it's presented in a humorous way. We have to be critical thinkers, questioning what we see and hear and doing our own research to verify the facts.
Absolutely, and that's especially important in today's media landscape, where we're constantly bombarded with information from all sides. We need to be able to filter through the noise and identify what's credible, what's satire, and what's outright disinformation.
So circling back to the Alex Jones clip, how do we reconcile the fact that it's clearly satirical, yet it also seems to be promoting a particular agenda?
That's the paradox of satire. It can be both subversive and manipulative. At the same time, it can challenge the status quo, but it can also be used to reinforce existing power structures.
So how do we as listeners navigate that complexity? How do we determine whether a piece of satire is genuinely trying to make us think critically or simply trying to manipulate us?
There's no easy answer, but I think a good starting point is to ask yourself a few key questions.
Okay.
What is the satirist target? What techniques are they using to achieve their comedic effect? And most importantly, what message are they ultimately trying to convey?
So it's not just about whether something is funny or not. It's about understanding the intent behind the humor and the potential impact it might have.
Exactly. Satire can be a powerful tool for social commentary, but it's important to remember that it's still a form of communication. And like any form of communication, it can be used for both good and bad.
This deep dive has definitely made me more aware of the nuances of satire and the importance of approaching it with a critical eye.
I think that's a valuable takeaway for anyone who consumes media, especially in today's digital age. We need to be more discerning about the information we take in, and satire is no exception.
Well said. Now, before we wrap up, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier about the dual nature of Infowars as both entertainment and a platform for promoting products. I'm curious to hear more about your thoughts on that.
Sure, I think it's important to recognize that Infowars, like many media outlets today, is a business. And like any business, it needs to generate revenue to survive.
So the product promotions are just part of the business model, but how does that square with the satirical content? Are they just using humor to sell products, or is there a deeper connection between the two?
I think it's a bit of both. On the one hand, they're clearly using humor to attract an audience and keep them engaged. And once they have that audience, it's natural to try to monetize it through product sales.
But it feels different with Infowars. It's not just like a late-night comedy show with commercial breaks. The product promotions are often interwoven with the satirical content in a way that makes them seem almost inseparable.
That's true, and I think that blurring of lines is intentional. They're trying to create a sense of community, a feeling that by buying their products, you're not just getting a good deal, You're also supporting a cause, a movement.
So it's like they're tapping into people's desire to belong, to be part of something bigger than themselves.
Exactly. And that's a powerful marketing tactic.
It's also a bit unsettling, isn't it? I mean, to think that people might be making purchasing decisions based on satirical content that's designed to provoke and entertain rather than to provide accurate information.
It certainly raises some ethical questions, and it highlights the need for greater media literacy, especially in an age where the lines between news, entertainment, and advertising are becoming increasingly blurred.
So, what can we as individuals do to become more media literate? What steps can we take to ensure that we're not being manipulated by satirical content or any other type of content for that matter?
I think the first step is to be aware of the different ways in which media can be used to influence our thoughts and behaviors. And that includes understanding the techniques used in satire, propaganda, advertising, and other forms of persuasive communication.
So, it's about recognizing the tools of the trade, so to speak.
Exactly. Once you understand how these tools work, you can start to see through them and make more informed decisions about the information you consume.
And that includes being critical of sources, verifying information, and seeking out diverse perspectives.
Absolutely. Media literacy is an ongoing process, and it requires constant vigilance, but the effort is well worth it.
Because in the end, it's about empowering ourselves to be informed citizens who can think critically and make sound judgments about the world around us. It's like we need a new set of lenses to view the world, lenses that help us decode the constant stream of information and disinformation coming at us.
I think you're right. It's almost as if we need to develop a satire detector,
Mm.
a mental filter that helps us differentiate between genuine attempts at humor and commentary versus those that are veiled attempts at manipulation.
But how do we build that filter? What are some of the warning signs that should make us raise an eyebrow when we encounter something that claims to be satire?
Well, I think one key element to consider is the source. What is their track record? Are they known for using humor in a responsible way, or do they have a history of blurring the lines between fact and fiction?
So, in the case of Alex Jones, we already know that he has a history of promoting conspiracy theories and making outlandish claims that should immediately raise a red flag, right?
Absolutely. It doesn't mean that everything he says is false or malicious, but it does mean that we should approach his content with a healthy dose of skepticism. We need to be aware of his biases and his tendency to sensationalize information.
And what about the content itself? Are there any red flags within the satire that might suggest it's not as straightforward as it seems?
One thing to watch out for is the use of dog whistles, coded language that appeals to certain groups or ideologies while remaining seemingly innocuous to others.
So, for example, when Alex Jones talks about globalists or the deep state, he's using language that resonates with people who subscribe to those conspiracy theories.
Exactly. And by using those terms in a humorous context, he's normalizing them, making them seem less extreme, less dangerous.
It's almost like he's using humor to Trojan horse those ideas into the mainstream.
That's a great analogy, and it's something we need to be very aware of. Satire can be a very effective tool for spreading ideology, especially when it's done subtly.
So it's not just about the jokes themselves, it's about the context in which those jokes are delivered and the potential subtext that might be embedded within them.
Precisely. We can't just take satire at face value. We need to dig deeper to consider the source, the audience, and the broader social and political landscape in which it's being produced.
It's a lot of work. It seems like it's getting harder and harder to simply enjoy a joke without having to dissect its potential hidden meanings.
I understand that sentiment, but I think it's a necessary burden we have to bear if we want to be informed and discerning citizens. We live in a world where information is weaponized, and satire is just one of the many tools that can be used to manipulate and mislead.
So it's not about avoiding satire altogether, it's about consuming it critically with our satire detectors fully activated.
Exactly, and I think the more we engage in these conversations, the more we analyze and dissect the different ways in which satire is being used, the better equipped we'll be to navigate this complex media landscape.
This deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about, and I'm sure our listeners feel the same way.
I hope so, because ultimately the goal of this deep dive wasn't to provide definitive answers, but rather to raise awareness and encourage critical thinking.
And with that in mind, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought. As we've seen, satire can be a powerful tool capable of both illuminating and distorting reality. It can make us laugh, but it can also make us think, and sometimes it can even make us question everything we thought we knew.
So the next time you encounter a piece of satire, whether it's from Alex Jones or any other source, take a moment to pause and consider the intent behind the humor. Ask yourself, what am I laughing at and why?
Because the answer to those questions might reveal more about yourself and the world around you than you ever imagined, and that, I think, is the true power of satire. So, until next time, keep those satire detectors on high alert and keep exploring the fascinating and ever evolving world of information and misinformation.